This episode's part of a special feature series on New York City and is a co-presentation with the Museum of the City of New York with generous support from the Rockefeller Brothers Fund. Find us at yourhometown.org or on your favorite podcast app.
My brother was in the playground, which was on Pacific Street between 3rd Avenue and Nevins. And he was playing with his friend Sankey Lee, who's Spike Lee's brother. And they were by themselves. And I remember the two of them coming home and like crying. And they told my mother we were in the playground and these little boys stole our money. And my mother's like, oh my God. And she's like, Lynn, you go back to that playground and you get their money. And I was like, oh my God. I was like, okay, but that's the role I occupied. I had to do those things.
Yeah.
And so on this particular day, I mustered all the strength that I had, and I sort of marched over to that playground, and I said to my brother and Sankey, it's like, who is the little kid who took your money? I'm like, was it that one? Was it that one? And they're finally like, it was him. And so I walked over to that little kid, and I'm like, you took my little brother's money, and I want it back. And he refused, and then I pried his little fingers open, and inside of his hand was $1 and $5 Monopoly money.
They weren't real bills.
But I remember it's like pink and white. I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
I went through all of this for Monopoly money.
Where did you grow up is a question we're all asked, a lot. But the answer is never as simple as a place on a map, is it? It's about the kid inside of us and what happened to them there, before we met the world and the world met us. I'm Kevin Burke, and this is Your Hometown. My guest is the playwright Lynn Nottage, one of the most important voices writing for the stage and screen today. In fact, Lynn is the very first woman ever to win not one, but 2 Pulitzer Prizes for drama. One was for her play Ruined, which she set in and around a bar and brothel in wartime Congo. And the other was for Sweat, which completely captured the hollowing out of a factory town in Pennsylvania in our current deindustrializing landscape. In both cases, Lynn opens our eyes and ears to characters in private, intimate spaces where and how real people really talk. It's a process that began for her in her hometown of New York City, where she was a little girl growing up in the Boerum Hill section of pre-gentrified Brooklyn. Now, on the surface, she says, Boerum Hill was the kind of neighborhood where people would pass through to get to other neighborhoods. This is the 1970s. But to Lynn, it was the setting for her story, starting on her block and in the brownstone where her parents, Wally and Ruby Nottage, raised her and her brother and hosted family, friends, artists, and activists. There was always a lot of noise in the house, filled with people, especially in the kitchen. Now, Lynn still lives in that very house today, a wife, mother, professor, and very busy playwright, surrounded by the memories and materials of her ancestors. And it was from that very space that she spoke to me on a snowy morning about the sights, sounds, and voices of her coming-of-age years in Brooklyn.
On my particular block, which is Dean Street, which was made famous in Jonathan Letham's book, Fortress of Solitude, when I was growing up, it was dominated by boarding houses. There was a sprinkling of communes. Lots of kids were on the block. It was at a time when there still was a bus that passed down, and as a result, there weren't a lot of cars, so that we, on weekends, could flood out of our houses and actually play in the street. We'd play, Capture the Flag and Kick the Can and all of those wonderful games that you played when you were young. And in terms of the soundtrack of the neighborhood, and I don't know whether this memory is accurate, but I remember that there was always salsa music that was blaring from boom boxes or open windows. And I remember at night at one of the boarding houses, there were men who would form this drum circle and they'd play the congas and the bongos and sing. It just always felt like there was a lot of ambient, festive sound in the community. It was really very alive. my home, it also felt vibrant. Our life centered around the table in my kitchen, which was this vibrantly colored Formica table. It was orange. It was bright orange, and it's still there. And I look at it, and it's
This is
still
1970s.
This is 1970s, and it seems like such an odd and wonderful choice. But it's this artifact that has remained. It's like the one artifact of my childhood that's completely intact is this Formica table. But my mother, who
It's still there.
It's still there. It's still the Formica
that's fantastic.
table is still very much there. My daughter and her partner are living down in that space, and every once in a while I go and visit that table, which they hate. But I have this real fondness and connection to, just because of what it represents.
Yeah.
It was this communal space where my mother, who was a school teacher, after work, she and her friends would gather and they drink this wine. There's like always a jug, like a half gallon of Mondavi wine that was sitting just beneath the table. And, they do their best to finish it every single day. And my mother would get a new one. And her friends were like educators like herself and civil servants and, a sprinkling of politicians and activists. And I just really, as a kid, admired sort of the passion and this genuine commitment that they had to each other. And my grandmother, also after work, she was this very petite woman. She was, between somewhere between 4'10" and 4'11", depending on how she liked to describe herself. And she'd wander in.
This is your mother's mother?
This is my mother's mother. My mother's mother.
Yeah.
Who lived in
Newton.
Yeah, Waple Newton, who lived in Crown Heights. But every single day she'd come and she'd spend time with us. It felt very much like a meeting space for women.
Where were you in the room, and sort of what was piquing your curiosity when you were listening to these voices?
Often I would be at the orange Formica table, but there was a dining room table that was also in the room, and more often I would sit there and do my homework because there was a little distance between me and them. But I loved eavesdropping and listening to what they had to say. My mother was an enormous gossip, but that didn't mean that she didn't have friends who weren't gossips. I mean, they were, I remember one of her friends, Fanny Dickerson, who was a best friend, and Fanny was also a school teacher, and she was from South and had this wonderful accent, and she just loved to gossip.
And about school and
about everything. I mean, it's it's what folks do. It's you gossip about what's happening at your schools. You gossip about what's happening in your neighborhood. You gossip about your friend circle. And Fanny just was this beautiful, gregarious person whose voice to this day still resonates in my head. I am a playwright, and I often think that the way in which I write dialogue really comes from active listening. And just how colorful the language was in my mother's circle. My grandmother was a great raconteur, and so often after a few glasses of wine, she would have the floor and she could just tell stories in the most beautiful, rapturous way. And I really think that in some respects that my grandmother's art of storytelling is the foundation for my art practice.
And Lynn, if you could walk downstairs to that Formica countertop and be in 1970 or 1971 or 72, what would you most want to know? In other words, that you can't know now, but you wish you could go back and say, figure something out. What would you most want to listen for or find out that's now gone?
I think that one of the things that I would want to know is more about the emotional reality of my family, because that's something as children that we're not as attuned to, is what was my mother going through in that moment when there was so much social upheaval. It was the midst of the feminist movement, the Black Power movement, and I just would want to know where her heart was. And I think the same is true for my father as well. is what were their relationships to the moment?
And is there a particularly vivid story, Lynn, when you think about those times, for example, your grandmother speaking or Fanny, that you held on to and that you really you can tell now that just stuck with you and it's lodged deep inside of you?
There are a few things that stay with me. For Aunt Fanny, she often spoke about her life down south and the fact that before she moved to New York and became a teacher, is that she actually lived on a farm. Her family was sharecroppers, and they picked cotton. And for whatever reason, just the notion of this woman who was in this urban setting being connected to the land in that way, and something that felt like a very ancient, painful practice, that story still resonates. And my grandmother, she was very social. She was a club joiner. She was a Zeta, which is a sorority, and often her stories had to do with people she encountered. She was born here, but her mother was born in Barbados, and one of her favorite things to do was reminisce about the trips that she took back to the old island and sort of the differences that she experienced of being, a New Yorker with this Brooklyn accent who was plopped in the middle of this very rural community in Barbados. And she just loved conversation. And a lot of times it had to do with what was happening in the world, and particularly for my mother, who was an activist, and a community organizer. And I think as I got older and I was really able to do much more active listening, what I realized that often what they were talking about was community organizing and boycotts. I remember at some point that they decided that they were all going to boycott the Rolling Stones because of language that they had on their album that they felt was racist and misogynist, and and my mother at some point decided that she was going to run for office, and she did. She became the county committee person, and her circle began to shift. It went from school teachers and her friends, and it became more activists and community organizers and politicians, and those conversations took on a real different kind of urgency and tenor.
Yeah, my wife grew up in Carroll Gardens, so I guess back then it was all called South Brooklyn. The neighborhoods really weren't named, although I think Boerum Hill was named right around the time you were born in the 60s as a neighborhood.
Right.
But my father-in-law, who was a longshoreman and then kind of entered the court system and worked in the courts in Brooklyn, he talked about just how powerful the district leaders were in Brooklyn. Meet Esposito and people like that. They really held a lot of sway.
Yeah, my mother was a district leader for a period of time, and she took the position quite seriously. And the district leaders at that time were also community organizers, and many of the politicians looked to them to help communicate with the constituency, but also when they were running for election, they really needed the support of these people who were closer to the ground.
Have these voices around you that you're imbibing and they become part of you, but also you have a voice too. And from a very young age, I think 5, you've said, you and your brother Aaron, your little brother Aaron, would perform plays, little skits for your parents and their friends.
Yes.
So sort of thinking about those voices in the house, can you give us the production notes, if you will?
I think that on some level I've always was writing plays, and those first plays were conjured in the living room of my house, and I wrote plays for myself where I was the protagonist, and often my brother, who is 3 years younger than me, Aaron, was the villain. And we have an interior staircase, which is somewhat unusual in a brownstone. So we have steps that come right into the living room, and chances are when we were performing the pieces, we just make a grand descent down those steps into the living room space, and generally the performance would take place at the base of the steps, and inevitably my brother and I would be dressed in our colorful pajamas or our bathrobes, and we'd perform some sort of sketch that involved a princess and a villain, or that would last
some variation on the
theme, which would last anywhere from 5 to 10 minutes until my mother would say enough. And that was the hook. Yeah, that was the hook. She'd be like, enough. Or there would be applause at some point that the adults all agreed upon. And we would be ushered back up the steps and told that children should not be seen or heard.
I'm picturing like the kids in The Sound of Music, they say goodnight, or the Cosby Show where they perform on the staircase. Like
right.
I'm trying to,
if only we were
picture these.
that charming and talented. Our performances were not as delightful as the Von Trapp family singers,
but you get credit for originality. Like it doesn't
did.
sound like you were just mimicking something. You were actually creating the stories.
Yeah, we were creating.
They weren't just like an adaptation of something.
Somewhere I in the house there are cassette tapes of some of these early attempts at
Is that right?
drama.
Wow.
Yeah, I have to figure out where they are, because I remember getting a tape recorder when I was young, and I became obsessed with not just recording my own thoughts, but I was also recording my parents' dinner party conversations, and I
that's amazing.
Isn't that amazing?
So you were
it's amazing.
You were
and
documenting.
I remember I used to go around my parents' dinner table when they had parties, and I just in my head I suddenly had an image of all of those beautiful people surrounding the table, and there was one man in particular, Paco, who was from Ponce, Puerto Rico, who just had the most resonant, deep, beautiful voice, and I loved taking the microphone and having him say hello. Hello. And
yeah, have you gone back and listened to them?
I haven't. I'm so afraid to play those tapes because of the fragility of the tape material, and I have to figure out where I can get them transferred so that I can listen, and I use that tape player to play music beneath some of our performances. I mean, they were very well thought through, and we memorized our lines, and we really fully committed to our performances.
That is awesome. And your brother, who's little brother, did he have much choice in this, or was he on board with you and sort of?
It's interesting, because I think my brother right now is a Brooklyn DA, which, as you know, is very performative. I mean, the courtroom is a theater, a different kind of theater space. And so I think underneath it all, there's part of him that is really still an actor. And so he was always an incredibly willing participant. I never had to twist his arm or nudge him. It's like, here's your part. This is what you say. And we go on now. I grew up in a generation where kids were free-range chickens. It's like the door was opened, you were given a little shove, and you went outside. And as we lived very much outdoors. I was a bookish kid, and so and I think part of the reason I became a playwright is that I'm an introvert extrovert. Which I think is the definition of playwriting, is that people who spend a lot of time sort of writing, but then we really need community to complete our task.
Yeah,
and so, we're collaborators by nature. And I think that as a kid, that's fundamentally who I was, is that I loved to read books. I loved my time in my room. But then inevitably there was a moment.
You had your own room.
I had my own room. Inevitably there was a moment where I just wanted to be outside. And I was very, very fortunate that our yard was the nexus point for all the kids on the block. It was concrete, it was open, it was almost in the middle of the block. And so the kids who lived on that side would come, the kids on the other side would come, and they'd all meet. And generally the kids played on their side of the block. But my yard was the one place where everyone could come together and play skelly and stoop ball and double dutch. And it just was this really beautiful a space that I spent a lot of my time in. But that said, there were playgrounds in the community that I would go to, and you still had old ladies with pillows who would sit in their windows, and if you were misbehaving, they'd say, Lynn, or more often it was my brothers, but Aaron, stop doing that, and they'd report it back to your mother. Or, if they saw you wandering someplace where you're not supposed to be, they'd be like, I'm going to tell your mother. And so you felt like there were really eyes and ears within the community that were taking care of all of us. And the fascinating thing about the architecture of the brownstone is the stoop, which is designed in some way like risers for an audience to sit on.
Yes.
And so you'd sit on those steps, and you'd watch life go by, whether it was life in your yard or whether it was life that was flowing up and down your streets. And the stoops were communal spaces. It's where, when you were very young, you could sit and your parents could see you. But as you got older and you're teenagers, it's a place where you'd hang out. And you could, you'd sit on the stoops until the wee hours of the morning, just talking to friends and gathering. But the stoop was also a place where we played stoop ball, and I remember using it in different ways. Back then, you had to be much more imaginative in the games that you played, because you didn't have all these electronics and iPad and Game Boys and all the things that kids are playing with now. And so things like a refrigerator box could give us at least 2 weeks of incredible fun. And I remember that on the stoop is that we'd ride the refrigerator box down the stoop. So
wow. Yeah.
And then we could make the refrigerator box into a clubhouse, and we could paint on it. The stoop was this really flexible space.
Yeah.
We also would venture forth as like a little posse of kids from the community. We'd go to Coney Island as a group. We'd get on the train and travel together.
On the F train.
F train. At 10 years old, if we were really adventurous, we'd go up to Times Square, be really scared, and then get on the train and come back home. And we'd go to Central Park, and we'd go to Prospect Park and the Village. We just had a very different relationship to New York City than I think kids to today. And I think a lot of that really changed with the disappearance of Eaton Pates, or Pat's, the kid in Soho who was on his way to school and just disappeared.
At 7:55 last Friday morning, Julie Patz says she took her son downstairs. She came back up and watched from this fire escape as he passed down West Broadway toward the bus stop, where a group of other children and parents were waiting. She never dreamed he didn't get on that bus, not until 4 o'clock in the afternoon, when he failed to return home.
It's so fascinating. It's like you can, that's the demarcation between the moment when New York felt dangerous as it was, it felt safe because it was a community. And then that was a line where we thought, oh, but we can't trust the community. And it doesn't, I'm raising my children in the house that I grew up in, and they don't have the same relationship to the community that I had, and they don't roam. My son is now 11. COVID has really altered everything, but he was just beginning. He was just beginning to sort of flex his independence and wander. The other thing is that there was a real divide between Brooklyn and Manhattan. Manhattan was the city, and for those of us who grew up in Brooklyn, we were considered to be incredibly provincial. It was bridge and tunnel. There were people on my block when I was growing up who even when I was in college, had never been to Manhattan. And we live one stop away. It's not like we're out in Bensonhurst.
You can walk across
the bridge, but
Manhattan Bridge, and you're there.
But they're literally, it had a very small time vibe that doesn't exist anymore because now Brooklyn is hip. But we also took enormous pride in where we came from. You think about how Spike Lee really owned his being a Brooklyn Knight, and we really his brand, but that was all of our brand. It's like what we had, what bonded us was that we lived in this place that was a little bit tough, that was regional. We had accents that were slightly different. We had more of an immigrant sensibility, working class sensibility, and we really clung to that. And so when you went to the Village, it just felt very different.
Yeah. And was there ever a time when you felt that danger was lurking around you, or that you were in danger as a kid?
It was New York in the 70s and 80s. It was very different than the New York it is right now. I mean, the city was undergoing an enormous financial crisis that was affecting every aspect of the city, from the transit system, the educational system, to just the way in which your garbage was picked up and your streets were swept. And our neighborhood, when we were growing up, was a high crime neighborhood. There was a lot of prostitution. I remember even in the mid 70s and late 70s, there was an article in the Daily News about the hot points of prostitution, and I was really shocked that the corner of my block was one of them.
No kidding.
No, but it
was a shock to you. But you saw.
Oh yeah, of course. Well, of course you saw it. I mean, there was so much. You walk down Nevin Street. It just was like the corridor. It was kind of like 11th Avenue used to be in Manhattan. Truckers just knew that this is the space that you travel. But our house was robbed 8 times. When I was growing up. Twice when I was there. Once when my brother and I were sleeping. My parents.
Twice when you were in the house?
Twice when I was in the house. Once when my brother and I were sleeping. My parents had gone someplace, and it was just after Christmas, because there were all the Christmas gifts, and someone had climbed through the.
People know.
They had climbed climbed down the fire escape, which is in the back of the house, climbed through my parents' bedroom window, and my brother and I were actually in my parents' bed. And one of the men said to me when I awakened, he's like, "Shh, little girl," and he's like, "Go back to sleep." And I actually went back to sleep. And I remember when my parents got home and they awakened us, and they're like, "What happened?" And I was like, "Well, a man climbed in the window. He told me to go back to sleep." And they ended up taking all of my father's hi-fi equipment and the Christmas gifts. They just kind of cleaned us out. That said, it's like as a kid, you just knew that at some point you would get mugged, and someone would take your what we called your train pass or your bus pass or your hat, or they'd rifle in your pockets and take your 25 cents. So it didn't feel like such a big deal. Right. It's just something that happened.
Okay, so those are the kinds of dangers kids like Lynn had to watch out for in New York at that time. Street-level crimes that could sometimes come in through the window. Other times, though, a very different kind of danger entered a family story. Not in the form of crime, but the stealing of one's own health and livelihood.
When I was about 12 years old and I was trying to remember it, exactly when it happened. My father was carrying some slate with one of his friends, and his friend tripped, and the slate fell into my father's abdomen. He fell back. It hurt, but he was fine. And I have such a vivid, specific memory of us going to Prospect Park after that and playing Frisbee. Just running and him diving. And then when he came home that night, he complained of being in pain, and then he didn't move for 2 years. And, he ended up being in the hospital for a period of time. He had some reconstructive surgery and was finally able to walk. He shrank a couple of inches. But it really it was devastating for the family. You know, my mother was a school teacher. You know, she was paying a mortgage on the brownstone. Granted, it's not what it was, because they paid very little for this house at the time, but still it was a staggering cost for someone like her. At the time, both of my brother and I were at school. We were going to St. Anne's, which is not the St. Anne's of today, but it was still sort of a private...
it's a private school in Brooklyn Heights, right?
And we had scholarships, and so she wasn't paying a ton, but still it was just a little too much for it to survive. And our lives changed. My mother had to take a second job. You know, she was working day and night to help us get through the moment. I switched from private to public school. Right. And it just, you know, I still think about those hard times. And one of my memories that sticks with me, because my mother was working day and night. And so often we'd come home and she wasn't able to cook dinner. And so we ended up eating, for a period of maybe 2 years, all of our meals at this restaurant called Steve's, which was a Greek diner run by this flamboyant guy named Steve, who always wore like a baby blue suit. And he greeted you, you know, and we'd have like our hamburger and our French fries, and we knew all of the waitresses who still had bouffants with cotton candy and who were smoking as they were serving, but they were our family. You know, these women, right. and I still have this wonderful memory of when my mother would finally, exhausted, be finished. Steve would always bring her like a Rob Roy, and he'd say, "There you go, my love." And she'd like drink, and she'd drink her Rob Roy, and then have a second, and then we'd go home.
Yeah, there's a character in your 2017 Pulitzer Prize winning play Sweat, Stan, who has an injury from work,
right?
And you see its effect on him. He's sort of the bartender at the gathering spot there, and I thought about the connection between him and your dad, because you saw the consequences of that in someone's life. But you're a kid, you're coming into adolescence, and your dad is sort of stuck there. It must have it changed you too.
It changed me. I think that one of the things that it made me as a worker is that from the time I was 12 years old, I began working like a maniac. I babysat. I always had my own money, because I knew in that moment I couldn't ask my mother for money because she didn't have it. Right. And so...
And those are the ages where you need it as a kid.
And where you need it.
Want to go to the movies and go to... Yeah.
And so I began babysitting. You know, I babysat for a woman who was recently divorced, and she had 3 little boys, and she still was young at the time and wanted to have a life, and so I ended up babysitting for them maybe 4 nights a week, and she'd stay out really late, and it was great. You know, she was my source of income. And then when I was in high school, I got a job at the Phoenix newspaper, which was a local Brooklyn circular, which had a liberal bent, and you know, this grizzled old editor named Mike Armstrong, who ran it like an old newspaper man, and we had manual typewriters, and we hit our deadlines. It was like click, 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 click. And I ended up working at the Phoenix all through much of high school and through college, and then I switched from the Phoenix to the Villager, which he also owned, which was its sister paper in the Village Voice, and that for me was really formative, just in terms of my identity as a writer and my interest in research and journalism, and how to immerse yourself in a culture that's different than your own. And I all think that stems from having to go to work and having to have a certain level of agency at a very young age. You know, I felt like I just don't want to be a burden, and I wasn't. I mean, I just have made my way in the world, and I feel an immense pride in that, not ever having to be dependent.
Lynn was anything but dependent as a teenager in Brooklyn. While working, she also had to commute a long way to school each day. We're talking the A train, the subway, all the way from her neighborhood to the High School of Music and Art in Harlem, way up in Manhattan. From there, she went to Brown University and the Yale School of Drama, and when she returned to live and work in New York City, it was in Manhattan, not in her childhood home in Brooklyn. That was the plan anyway. One thing I wanted to fast forward to is you begin writing plays in the 90s after working at Amnesty International, and you're sort of getting your feet wet as a playwright, and then something happens, you move home.
Yes.
Your trajectory is out of the city, but then you come back to that brownstone on Dean Street, and what brings you back there is that your mother is very ill. You talked about this. She was suffering from Lou Gehrig's disease, and you were pregnant at the time. And I'm trying to think about what it was like for you to be caring for your mother, the one who had nurtured you in that space, as you were getting set to become a mother, and just sort of what that was like in terms of your own path, your own identity.
It was an impossible moment when I returned home. And when I left Brooklyn, which I left really in 1986, at a moment when New York was at the height of the AIDS crisis and the crack epidemic, and it just felt dark in ways that my spirit couldn't manage. I thought, I'm just not going to come back. I'm going to land someplace else. I want an apartment with lots of light that's far away from where I grew up. And I ended up living on the Upper West Side and then moving, to 110th Street, where I had a beautiful view of St. John the Divine in a rent-stabilized pre-war building. And I thought, I've hit the jackpot. There's no way.
The promised land.
It was the promised land. Like, this is it. Like, this big, solid, airy apartment. And I had just left working at Amnesty International and was trying to figure out what kind of life I could make as an artist. I had recently married. I was pregnant. And my mother was diagnosed, as you mentioned, with Lou Gehrig's disease. And she called me one day and she said, I don't think I can go this alone. And as you know, it's such an insidious, impossible disease, which robs you slowly of your ability to move any of the muscles in your body, and eventually, your throat closes up and you can't breathe. And so I realized I just, I love my mother. And even though I don't want to move back to Brooklyn, we decided to move back, and we did a slight renovation and had the very difficult task of asking the tenants who had literally lived in the apartment for like 40 years. I mean, they were there almost as long as my parents were in the apartment. And I remember it was three sisters who'd moved from, I want to say it was North Carolina when they were like 18, 19, 20. And so they had grown up in this house, and only one was left, Carrie and her husband, and we had to ask them to leave. It was 1997, and they were paying $400 rent. And I knew they're never going to find that again. Have a two-bedroom apartment for $400. I mean, fortunately for them, they had saved enough money from the low rent to actually buy a place. So it has a happy ending in that case. But we moved back. And I just, it was hard because we're living in a place and trying to renovate it and make it livable for us while I was caring for my mother, who literally needed 24-hour care. And then I had my baby, and so I was changing my mother's diaper and changing my baby's diaper, and just under a great deal of stress. And so and so we moved back, and it ended up being the right choice and the best choice. And we've now been here. My mother died in 1997 since then, and we've really built a new community. And the community, of course, in even the 23 years that we've been here, keeps rolling over and shifting and reconfiguring. But we're here, as is our neighbors who live directly across the street, who also grew up in the house. It's like we're the two African-American families standing. We're like, hey, we see each other. And there's this real connection and bond. Like, we're not going to sell our homes like everyone else did.
Yeah. But you've talked, Lynn, specifically about, the seeds of your playwriting and how, in some ways, your playwriting has its origins in the gaze of your mother's gaze, I think is the way that you describe it. And that, for you, it was a looking glass as a kid. And I wanted to just pause there and ask you about that gaze and sort of that looking glass and what you meant to convey by that and what that gaze meant to you.
And when I'm talking about my mother's gaze, I'm really speaking about all of the unspoken in the experiences of Black women in America, going further back than my mother to my grandmother who were women of a specific era who weren't able, because of circumstances, to fully actualize, and they have so much they experienced and so much complexity which they didn't articulate. And I think that my practice really stems from my desire to want to give voice to what got unsaid.
And then when you kind of put that in the story of your mother's life, which, just for context for people, you were only in your early 30s at this time. This is very young to lose a parent, and really hard. And also to see the way that she died through, Lou Gehrig's disease, it's so painful. I'm thinking about the voices you talked about before in the house, and how animated and full it was, and how active she was, and that gaze, and how in the end, as you were saying, you're sort of left only with that gaze, with someone who's dying from that disease. The voice goes. And so what it was like to see her go sort of from that full embodiment of life to losing her voice, which was so important to your ear as a kid.
Well, it's really painful to watch someone who you love so much and who lived a very robust, animated life, lose the ability to move and eventually lose the ability to speak. And she had this incredibly rich, beautiful voice. It's like one of the favorite aspects of my mother. And I think it's what made her so popular is that she had this lovely laugh that just came from deep down, that just lit up a room. And she had the voice of an actress, even though she never acted. She just had an instrument that had a beautiful quality. And eventually, before she died, the only thing that she could use was her eyes. And we'd work with an eye chart. And it was really laborious for her to sort of blink out in a sentence. And I remember one of the last things that she blinked out was that she loved my daughter, Ruby. She just said, "I love you" to her. And it just, I remember after she did, I had to drop the chart and weep. And she's like, no, trying to say, lift it up. And I didn't have the strength, but it was in those moments very hard to navigate the emotional space that's required when you're slowly letting go of all of the parts of someone that you love. And it's really fascinating. You talk about someone's relationship to the house. My mother had wanted to die in the home. And in the moment that she was dying, I sort of panicked and I made the choice to call the ambulance. And when they arrived, I'm like, you can't have her. I'm going to keep her. They're like, now that we're here, we're going to have to take her. And so it's like this tug of war.
Oh, no.
And they took her to the hospital. And I, because I was her health proxy, made the decision not to have her resuscitated. And strangely enough, she was supposed to die in an hour. And she held on for 8 hours until all of her friends in the family could get to the hospital. And the very last person to arrive, which was 18 hours later, was her mother. My mother was an only child. And literally the moment my grandmother stepped into the room and we formed this beautiful circle, we said, the Lord's Prayer, and she literally very peacefully died. We returned from the hospital maybe an hour after that, and we walked into the house and the telephone rang. And it was a friend of hers, Shirley, who she hadn't spoken to probably in 10 years. And I picked up the telephone and Shirley says, "Is your mother okay?" And I'm like, "Why do you ask?" She said, "I literally was standing in my kitchen. I turned around and I saw your mother there." And I said, "What did she say?" She said, "It's okay." And I thought, oh, that's what I needed to hear, because I was feeling so much guilt over having made this decision to rip her body out of this house and have her have a death that she didn't want in the hospital. And then moments after she said it was okay, our boiler, which was the most ancient boiler in New York City, it's like when exploded. It just went boom, and the entire house shook. And this fissure ran all the way up through the house, and then the wall strangely began to weep. And so all this water, so all the way down, and I was like, wow, it's like this is a Marquez moment, like a magical realism moment in which my mother is speaking to us.
What a force.
Force.
And she was the house.
And she was
the house.
She was the house. Somehow she made her presence known, and that her connection with this space was so deep and intense that she just left, with a bang.
And Lynn, I understand that you have written about this in some way. There's a play, Emperor Breathes, The Emperor and the Scribe, about this dynamic and your mother, but you haven't released it to the world yet.
No, I haven't.
I'm wondering, it's sort of about that, and what about that particular story that you've told is leaving you with that feeling that it's not ready, and how will you know when you are ready?
Well, it's when I was working on The Emperor's Breathe, it's really during, I'm trying to even remember, because that whole time was such a blur, because I was like a new mother and I was dealing with like all of the biggest emotions that one experiences in life, but at once. And so I can't remember whether I was writing it while my mother was dying or whether I wrote it just after, but the play was still infused with all of what I was feeling, which was the complicated emotions that you have when a parent dies. It's despair, it's liberation, it's all, it's guilt. It's all those things that you have to reconcile, and that's just part of the grieving process. And so I did what I do, which is to pour that energy into writing. And so I created this play, which was called The Emperor and the Scribe, and it should have been abundantly clear to me that it was about me and my mother, but it wasn't. And I had the experience like a year, maybe it was a year and a half after my mother died. I was invited to go to a conference at, I believe it was the University of Michigan, or maybe it was University of Wisconsin. It was on a lake. And very cold, and it was a conference on African American playwrights, and they said, do you want to read a new play? And I'm like, I have a new play, it hasn't been shared. And so we rehearsed that particular piece, and I remember thinking, oh God, why did I even come? This feels like it's premature, and I'm not really ready to re-enter this realm and to be working on my writing, because I'm still healing. And we read the play, and it read rather well. And afterwards, I had said to the moderator, it's like, I really just don't want to talk about why I wrote this play, because it came out of such a deep personal space that I think it will be painful. And she put me on stage by myself, and she handed me a microphone, and there were 500 people, and this light was shining on me. And the first question she asked is, why did you write this play? And I remember being so frustrated and angry that I burst into tears as I went to explain why I wrote it. And I realized, I really haven't mourned in this way. And I sobbed. And I literally couldn't stop sobbing. And there were 500 people watching me. And really recently, I was somewhere, and a woman said, you probably don't remember me, but I was the woman who literally climbed out of the audience, went on the stage, and I helped you off. And I'm like, oh, thank you. And then I promptly put that play in a box and never looked at it again.
By the time we spoke, Lynn had lived at least 3 different acts in her Brooklyn brownstone. There was the little girl listening in the kitchen. There was the caretaker for her mother as she lay dying. Then there was the Lynn who lived with her dad for many years before he died much more recently. And then there's the Lynn of today, of now, the mother, professor, and playwright, living and working and raising a family during this terrible long pandemic. And I was curious to know how she keeps all of these selves around in a house that's at once a bustling, very much alive place, and on the other, a museum, an inheritance from her mother and father. Where do you, in your house, but also in your mind, go to commune with these people and these voices that were so shaping? But you've sort of given us a clue, which is you do it through your imagination, it sounds like.
Yeah, I do it through imagination.
Versus a place.
I think I don't really anymore hear their voices in the way that one might imagine. But I do periodically visit them in photo albums. Every once in a while, it's I just want to see my grandmother Wapel, who, had this spicy, irreverent wit, and I kind of miss that flavor in my life, and I'll just go and look at her, and, in her bathing suit holding a cocktail, and I think, oh, there you are. I'm so happy to see you. And, and all those memories will flood back. And it's the same with my mother. And, more recently with my father, who I actually visit more because that wound is fresher.
Yeah. It's only a few
and
years.
And because I lived with him for 23 years in ways that most adults don't live with their parents, and he came with us on all of our vacations, he just occupies much bigger space in my life and my memory than my mother, who died when she was 62, and my grandmother, who died 15 years ago.
Yeah. And I find as I go through life, I'll be 45 in February, and I lost my grandfather when I was 4, my grandmother who was very close to at 15, my Uncle Ed, who is really the reason why I do what I do. I love talking to him as a kid when I was in my 20s. And I find it very painful to feel my brain over time increasingly unable to access their voices in full.
Yes.
I can get a word, I can get a phrase, but I can't get sentences and paragraphs anymore.
Yeah.
And it's painful to feel your brain
Yes.
letting go in that way, or fracturing. I find that very painful.
It is hard. I had described earlier sort of the resonance of my mother's voice, and I can talk about it, but I can't really, really hear it anymore. It's like I know what it was, and I can hold on to that knowing, but I can't hear it, and that's hard.
Yeah.
I can still hear my father's voice, and strangely, I can hear my grandmother's voice just because she talks so much. It will take me like years to get her out of my head.
It was spicy too, you said.
It's
right?
spicy, yeah. I mean, she was like, yeah. She'd call me like every day I was in college. My grandmother would call me.
That's beautiful. I mean, it is something to think about too, that playwriting itself can be this act.
As a child, you don't really think about yourself being part of living history. Particularly as an African American, because for so long we didn't place a lot of value on our personal archive. And so I wish that I had listened and engaged with much more intention when I was young. Certainly if I could get into a time capsule and go back, I think that I would absorb in a very different way. There's this really sort of wonderful and sad story. My father grew up on a block just around the corner from Mount Morris Park, which is now Marcus Garvey.
I saw that.
Park. And for decades, every summer, all of the old neighborhood, like all of the gang members, would gather together in Mount Morris Park in this one section, and they'd drink and listen to music and reminisce, and it was always like a large a collection of men. And I remember one day, because my father died when he was 89, he said he took the train, the IRT up to Harlem, and he went to the park, and he sat on the park bench where they all met, and he said he sat there for 2 hours, and he realized that he was the last man standing. And he said it just was heartbreaking. And you think about sort of the passing of moments or community. And I thought with that went all of that collective knowledge and that wisdom of what Harlem was. And I wish that I had had the wherewithal to document those gatherings, because there's probably an astonishing group of men that were there, and, intellectual capital that was lost. I'm hyper aware of the necessity, particularly as an African American woman, as a Black woman, of preserving the archive, because as a child I didn't have access to the archive in the same way, because my grandparents just shed so many of their things and didn't think about what would the next generation want, or what is really necessary to preserve. It's like there's a story. My grandmother, Dorothy, who lived in Harlem, who was my father's mother, and there was a period of time, a long period of time, in which she worked as a domestic, and she went back to school actually in her 50s in the 1960s to become a nurse at Harlem Hospital. But she worked as a domestic, and she was working for an elderly white woman who who was on the verge of death, and she said, "Dorothy, you've worked very hard for me, and I really want you to have something." And this woman had all these Renoirs and all of these beautiful things. And my grandmother said, there's that Renoir that I really always love and coveted. And she's like, "Dorothy, it's yours." And there was another woman who was the cook. And she said, "Oh, I also like that painting." And my grandmother said, "Oh, you know what? You take it." And it just, for me, points out how my grandmother, in all of her sort of homespun wisdom, didn't understand the value of certain things. And I think the way in which she treated the Renoir is the way in which she treated her life.
Yeah. And when I saw her in the 1940 census, because I was looking for your dad, and I saw there he was in Harlem, like you mentioned.
Yeah, he lived with my grand. Yes.
Yeah, he was living with his mother, Dorothy, and his grandmother, Ida.
Yes.
And I realized that, Ida's from Florida. Ida's name is Crump.
Yes.
And the family name in Crumbs from the Table of Joy, one of your early plays, is Crump.
Yeah.
And I realized this is Lynne at work. She's sort of creating characters and stories around a missing archive, but she has some things. She has a name. She has places.
She's places.
But then there you are. But it's your way of creating an archive is through drama, is through imagination. It's a very fascinating kind of mix of fact and imagination.
Well, it's also a way of keeping them alive. My grandmother, both of my grandmothers, my grandmother Dorothy died in 1997, and when she died, she had no friends left alive, and so we weren't able to really give her the funeral that she had wanted because there was no one to come but our immediate family, and so we sort of gathered to say goodbye amongst ourselves. And the same was true of my other grandmother, Waple, who was such a social butterfly, but also because she died when she was so old, her community was gone, and I never gave them the funerals that I felt their lives deserved. And I think in some ways, as I move forward, is that I want to write for them and about them in ways that will become those living memorials. That, it's better than a headstone, is that they will live in 3 dimensions in ways in which I can conjure them and keep them alive.
The last question I want to ask you, and I ask every guest this, I end every interview the same way, is I go to that great Brooklyn poet Walt Whitman in Leaves of Grass, Song of Myself, because this is a show about place.
Right, and who didn't live and he didn't live. Walt Whitman lived fairly close to here. Yeah,
and thinking about communing with spirits, I want to read these passages from Song of Myself and then ask you a question on the backside of it. Mm-hmm. So Walt says, "I bequeath myself to the dirt to grow from the grass I love. If you want me again, look for me under your boot soles. You will hardly know who I am or what I mean, but I shall be good health to you nevertheless, and filter and fiber your blood. Failing to fetch me at first, keep encouraged. Missing me one place, search another. I stop somewhere, waiting for you." And Lynne, we've talked about sort of how we try to reach back to the past and hear those voices and hold on to them. But I'm thinking about someone either in your own family or maybe a student of drama, 50, 100, 200 years from now, who discovers Lynn Nottage and her work and wants to commune with you and your spirit and comes to New York, comes to Boerum Hill, comes to Dean Street, right? And it's just looking around and thinking, where can I stand? Where can I go? Where can I be to commune with that spirit of Lynn Nottage? Where will I find her? Where would you tell someone roaming the city looking for you in your hometown? Where would you tell them to go to feel you?
I think that, 100 years from now, if someone was looking for me and still somehow wanted to connect with a perspective that perhaps would have been mine, if they sat on the stoop and they looked at the pear tree, which I planted, which, began as a sapling, which is now, still in its teenage years. And that's beautiful and blossoming, but 100 years from now, I imagine that tree would still be there. And so they would see a little of what I had planted, a little of what I had hoped would be part of the textures of the community. And they would see something that hopefully had grown quite beautiful and majestic, and that's rooted in a space that I helped build. There was there's just like, a space for it. There was a patch of dirt. And when I moved back, I thought, we're going to have a tree, that I want a tree there. And then, it took a year, but finally the Parks Department one summer afternoon drove up without saying anything, planted that tree, and drove off.
Lynn Nottage, this has been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for spending this time with me. I know it went long, but I just felt, I just felt so absorbed in the conversation. So thank you for that. I know you're really busy.
Well,
but it's such a pleasure. You're an amazing storyteller. I knew it would be a special time with you.
Well, thank you for allowing me to travel back and revisit things that I haven't thought about in years. It just filled me with a lot of joy.
Your Hometown is a Kevin Burke production. For more, please visit our website at yourhometown.org, where you can find our past episodes and illustrations and maps that bring each guest's hometown vividly to life. You can also follow us on your favorite podcast app and on social media, on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Also, please check out the show's New York City series page, including information on live events on the Museum of the City of New York's website at mcny.org/yourhometown-podcast. Now I'd like to thank the wonderfully talented team that brings so much joy and passion to making Your Hometown with me, especially our executive producer, Robert Krulwich, art director, Nick Gregg, editor and sound designer, Otis Streeter, composer and performer, Sterling Steffen, and our researcher, Shakila Khan. Our branding and website design is by Tama Creative, and our social media team is led by Cure and Jessica Saint-Bear. A special thanks, too, to our partners this season, the Museum of the City of New York. Now, none of this would have been possible without the Rockefeller Brothers Fund or our other financial supporters, and they have my deepest thanks for their commitment to this series. Until next time, thanks so much for taking this ride with me. And remember, everyone's from someplace, and everywhere is somewhere.